fairly conservative organization. And you ask the average person, why do you wear a helmet? And they'll say, you know, to protect your head from concussions and stuff like that. And that's not true. As it happens, helmets were made originally to prevent your head from splitting open from severe,
also important.
Severe cranial trauma. And there's ways to test for that.
Okay, yes.
That work well. Yeah. And as a result, helmets today are very good at preventing severe cranial trauma. Like your head splitting open and you're dying.
Yeah.
But almost no helmets, very few, are designed to prevent concussions. Because we don't understand them well enough to figure out how you stop them. And one of the main, there's a couple of main ways you get concussions. I mean, one, you know, you say smash your head against a wall, okay. That's one way, but actually, you know, helmets do a fairly good job of absorbing that impact. One of the main ways now appears to be rapid rotation of the head. And basically what's happening is the brain tissue is sort of stretching and kind of tearing, and if that happens badly enough in certain parts of the brain, and it can depend whether it's left, right, forward, back, you know, rotational. You get different effects from these different sorts of injuries. You get different degrees of concussions and that sort of thing. And you know, there's no helmet that's going to make that better,
right?
Unless it's somehow attached to your shoulders.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, if you're into car racing, you may be aware there is some technology in car racing where you actually have a helmet that's tied to your shoulders to just do that, to prevent it from whiplashing forward, and it works as far as I understand it. But the energy has to go somewhere, so it would end up breaking like your collarbone or something like that in a really severe situation. But probably better that than getting a bad head injury.
Right. So
you do have some innovative technology coming along now, like MIPS. You got some helmets with MIPS. The basic idea behind MIPS is pretty straightforward. It's a helmet over a helmet. So if you were hitting something that was going to rotate your head, well, it hits the top part of the helmet and rotates that, but the bottom part doesn't rotate. And your head doesn't rotate that much. It's mostly for football. In speed skating, we actually had kind of a really cheap version, which was we'd have our helmets, but we've had basically helmet covers with your athlete number on them. And if you hit something that was sticky, the helmet cover would come off, and your head wouldn't rotate too much. Kind of a $5 solution.
Sure, yeah.
And I don't think there's been any studies done on this, but I would bet that actually was helpful in reducing the frequency of concussions potentially in that sport. But we get weird stuff going on in short track speed skating, equestrian horse racing, aerials and moguls, where people are wearing helmets and they're hitting soft surfaces and they're getting concussions. That seems odd. Everybody thinks that sounds weird because, you know, you're wearing a helmet, you're hitting a soft surface. Why would you get a concussion? And we think it has to do with the rotational aspect. That if I hit a soft surface, my body and my head will not go in the same way, and then we get a torque on the neck and you get a rotation. And getting to the whole behavior thing that I was talking about before, I used to fall all the time when I started speed skating. I fell once or twice a race. It was terrible. But you know, we'd be going into these pads that weren't that great, and I was a chicken, so I'd be like going into the boards all the time. I was very stiff.
Yeah.
I never got a concussion. I fell 100 times, probably more than that. A lot of kids today in speed skating, they see the nice soft pads, and they just sort of totally relax their body going into the pads, and that sets you up for this sort of whiplash situation. So a simple behavioral solution is tell everybody to tense up before they hit, because with crashes, it's kind of an interesting physics thing. The softest spring, if your body's a spring and the pads are another spring and your helmet's another spring, the softest springs absorb the most energy in an impact.
Okay.
So the key is for you not to be the softest spring. And so if you hit a brick wall, guess what? You're the softest spring.
Right.
The brick wall is a pretty stiff spring. You're a pretty soft spring.
Yeah.
You absorb the energy ultimately by breaking bones, if necessary.
Yeah.
But if you hit a soft pad, the pad absorbs the energy. But if you are relaxed, well, then you're kind of soft too, and you're going to absorb more energy. So it's this sort of thing that's going on, and yeah, so there's been some interesting research around helmets, but progress on certification for concussion-proof helmets there hasn't been a ton of progress there, not as much as most people think. There are starting to be some helmets that will probably protect against concussions in certain situations, but ultimately it's going to be very difficult to really solve this problem without it being more of a behavioral solution. And so you see in hockey the push to prevent checking until certain ages. That probably is helping quite a bit because it's enforcing a safe behavior.
Right.
Now, there's people argue that once they start checking, they don't know how to do it and they do it worse. Fair enough, that's worth a discussion and some research. But the bottom line is you're not checking each other. You're greatly reducing the chance of concussion.
Right. Yeah.
And much like if a child gets a bad bone injury when they're young, and it can interfere with the growth plates and perhaps interfere with the growth. It's been found that concussions affect children, potentially can have greater harm in the long term, because can they can that set up a long-term sort of disability issue, especially if they repeatedly get concussions? Because if you're tearing a lot of the brain tissue, young bodies can generally recover from that. But if it's done repeatedly, it can get really bad. And you got all these proteins running around in the brain that weren't supposed to be, because they're kind of leaking out of the stretched tissue. And that's where the research is going these days, to look at sort of biomarkers of concussion, evidence that the brain tissue's been stretched and things have leaked out where they shouldn't have, and that's causing some level of physiological change in the brain.